Hello and welcome to my lecture for Philosophy 3200 on socialist versus capitalist anarchism. This lecture is going to be about explaining the two main varieties of anarchist theory that have historically been held. Now first, there are some background ideas that I have to explain before talking about the merits of these philosophies. So first, anarchists are people who believe in a social order without government. The typical motivations for this are they place high value on personal freedom. Especially for socialist anarchists, they place high value on equality and opposition to exploitation. Also, for all anarchists, there's a problem with the arguments for the legitimacy of government, that there just aren't any very good arguments for it. And anarchists are also very sensitive to the dangers of government. There have been a lot of bad things that governments have done over the centuries. Many people have been killed by their government and oppressed by their government and so on. Now, what is government? So there's a very famous definition of government due to Max Weber. Max Weber is basically the founder of sociology, and he defined government as He defined the state as, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Now, as a side terminological note, people in political philosophy use the word state interchangeably with government. In the United States, people sometimes use the word state to refer to, like the state of Colorado. But in political philosophy, when we say that, we mean the government in general. Okay, now there might be some problems with Weber's definition. You might notice that there are plenty of legitimate uses of physical force that don't involve the government. So if somebody attacks you and you physically defend yourself, that's a legitimate use of physical force. Now, what Weber would probably say is, yeah, but it's only considered legitimate because the state authorizes it, because you're legally authorized to defend yourself in such a situation. But that's a little bit questionable because most people think it's legitimate even if the government hadn't authorized it. However, be that as it may, there are two key attributes of the state that Weber talks about that are important and that are widely accepted. They're that the state is monopolistic and that it's coercive. So it's widely agreed, whether or not you accept exactly Weber's definition, it's widely agreed that the government is coercive. In other words, it issues commands to people and it forces them to obey them. It doesn't simply ask you to obey its directives. There's a threat that some armed officers will come and do something to you if you don't obey their commands. It's also widely agreed that the state is monopolistic. In other words, it's a kind of organization that does not allow competitors. So if you try to set up a competing organization that does the same things that the government does, the government will send armed men to forcibly shut you down. If you try to set up your own police force or your own court system, or you try to make your own laws, if anyone other than the government does that, then the government will forcibly shut them down. So that's the monopoly aspect. Okay, now these are some more concepts that we have to explain before talking about the varieties of anarchism. So I discussed this in previous classes, but in case you missed some of this, capital is defined standardly in economics as it's a kind of good that's used repeatedly to produce other goods. So if you have a factory, that's an example of capital. The equipment in the factory that's used to make other things is capital. Also, money that investors use to expand a business, that's considered capital. Incidentally, the raw materials that you make goods out of are not considered capital. So it's the stuff that you use over and over again. So like if you're making some clothing, then the cloth that you make the clothing out of is not considered capital, but the sewing machines are. Because the cloth is just going to be used up as soon as you produce a piece of clothing and then it goes out the door. But the sewing machine is used repeatedly. It's used over and over again to produce more. Capitalism is an economic system in which capital is privately controlled. So a particular individual can just own a bunch of capital and can become a capitalist, as we say. So a capitalist is a person whose income derives from simply owning a bunch of capital. Also, another definition of capitalist is just a person who supports capitalism, this economic system in which private individuals can own capital. Socialism, by contrast, is an economic system in which capital would be collectively controlled. There are two varieties of this. So there's state socialism. This is a system where the government controls all of the capital, and it's said to control the capital on behalf of the workers. So this is the kind of socialism that they had in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and China, and that they still have in North Korea. This obviously didn't work out very well. The other variety of socialism is anarcho-socialism, also sometimes called social anarchism or socialist anarchism. This is a system in which capital would be controlled collectively by the workers. That is, businesses would be run as worker cooperatives. So in this system, all of the workers have an ownership stake in the business and they have a say in how the business is run. Now, historically, there are two varieties of anarchism. Historically, the most popular variety of anarchism was socialist anarchism. So the original famous anarchists from the 19th century, like Mikhail Bakunin, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Peter Kropotkin, were all socialist anarchists. Capitalist anarchism has started to become more popular more recently, though obviously neither of these is very popular. But capitalist anarchism started to be advocated more prominently by Murray Rothbard, David Friedman, and other libertarian figures in the late 20th century. The difference is, as indicated by the previous slides, the socialist anarchist wants there to be worker control of capital. The capitalist anarchist is okay with having private control of capital. They both agree that there shouldn't be a state. Now I'm going to say more about how socialist anarchism is supposed to work, because you might find it hard to understand how you could have this society without a government. The socialist anarchists imagine society being organized into a large number of small communes. It's not clear exactly how big these would be, but probably just a few hundred people. Businesses would be collectively owned by the workers, as discussed previously. That's what a worker cooperative is. How would laws be made? Well, basically these communes would make rules democratically, that is, by the will of all of the people who are members. And there are two ways that this might work. They might make rules directly, and this could work differently in different communes. They might make rules directly by everybody just voting on each rule that was going to be made, or they might elect functionaries to make rules for them. These communes might also organize into larger groups for mutual protection. This was suggested by Mikhail Bakunin, because the entire world isn't going to become socialist simultaneously. So if you become a socialist anarchist society, you still have to worry about other countries in the world that haven't become socialist, and they might attack you. So you should join together for mutual protection with other communes. But this doesn't entail creating a larger government. It just means that you sign some kind of agreement with other communes to help defend each other. Now you might wonder at this point, how does this count as anarchy? It sounded a lot like it's just a kind of decentralized democratic government. Now, I don't want to argue too much about how we should use the terminology. Basically, what the socialist anarchists would say is, well, it's different from the current governmental society because membership in these communes would be voluntary in a way that membership under current states is not voluntary. So in our current society, basically everybody is just born into a government and basically has no choice. So if you want to get a different government, it's essentially impossible for you to change the government of the country that you live in. There's essentially zero chance that you could actually significantly change the government. You can sometimes move to another country, but that is actually very difficult. In some cases, your government will not allow you to leave. In other cases, your government will allow you to leave, but no other government will allow you to come in. And these governments have taken control of all the habitable areas of the earth. So basically, the overwhelming majority of people have no choice in what government they're subject to. And the idea of the socialist anarchists is that you would have a lot more choice because you could move to a different commune and there would be a very large number of them. So you would have a much better chance of finding one that you were satisfied with. Also notice that the costs of moving go down dramatically if there's a very large number of different communities that you could join. So if you have to move in the current system, if you have to move out of the United States, there's a very large cost to that because you'll be very far away from your family and friends. You probably have to leave your job and you'll leave your culture behind. You might wind up going to a country where they don't even speak your native language. So these are very large costs, and besides the fact that it's very difficult to get the government of another country to accept you, right? If there's a very large number of small communities and you move to another one, you don't have to necessarily move thousands of miles away or go to a radically different culture or anything like that. A second thing the socialist anarchists would say is their proposed society would be a lot more equal. They want to reduce or eliminate social hierarchies where there are some people who have most of the power and then other people who are powerless. And they think that that differentiates their system from a traditional government. Now, you might still wonder whether that really makes it anarchist, but I think we shouldn't argue about semantics. So if they want to call their proposed type of society anarchy, we can let them call it that. Right now, the socialist anarchists have ideas about what kinds of policies the socialistic communities would adopt and should adopt. Crime would be dealt with by the commune hiring a security force that would protect against criminals, people who would try to rob each other or attack other members of the community. People who violate the rules that were adopted by the community would be assigned a punishment by the community, or they might even be exiled if it was a sufficiently serious crime. The socialists also want society to support anyone who needs support, so including pregnant women, children, the elderly, and the handicapped. They would be supported if they were unable to work. They would be supported at the expense of the rest of society. Socialists frequently also say that there should be and would be free education and health care for everybody. Some of them also suggest that we should abolish wages and money in a really extreme move. But not all of them say that extreme stuff about having no money. What are the motivations for this? So the socialist anarchists are typically motivated by strong beliefs in equality and freedom and stopping exploitation. So their idea is that this kind of socialist anarchist society would be much more equal. Everybody would have equal power and wealth. And under the status quo, power and wealth are very unequal. Now, this is partly because our society is so large and the government is so large and powerful. That prevents most individuals from having any meaningful say in the government. But if you have much smaller communities, then it becomes possible for ordinary individuals to have a meaningful say. Also, under the status quo, because of this difference in power, it becomes possible for the powerful few to coerce and exploit the less powerful people. The socialist anarchists also just think capitalism in general is inherently exploitative, that the people who own capital are extracting surplus value produced by the workers. That idea came from Karl Marx and is very popular among socialists today, even the anarchist socialists. Okay, what about capitalist anarchism? How would that work? So in the capitalist anarchist society, worker cooperatives would still be possible, but not required. It would be perfectly okay for particular individuals to own businesses and to hire laborers. So the capitalist anarchist doesn't want to prohibit worker-controlled businesses. They just want to say you can have either kind of business, and both of them could exist and likely would exist at the same time. The essential functions of the state would not be eliminated, but rather privatized. So you could have private competing security agencies that would take the place of the government police. They would be similar to the police, except that there would be multiple competing agencies doing the same function. Also, there would be private competing arbitration companies that would replace the government courts. So these arbitration companies would do the functions of the government courts that the government courts are presently doing, except there would be many of them operating in the same area, and so they would be in competition with each other. Now, we'll say more about how that would work in future classes, so I'm not going to say too much about that right now. For this lecture, I'm just going to try to focus on which is better, capitalist or socialist anarchism. What kinds of policies would exist under capitalist anarchism? So the idea is that laws would be essentially made by the arbitrators. So if two people have a dispute, one person thinks the other person did something wrong and the second person thinks he didn't do anything wrong, they take it to a neutral third party to have it resolved, a third party who has some reputation for fairness in the society. Okay, now, and then these arbitrators would make a decision based upon, what they generally thought that people in the society would want, the kinds of rules that most people in the society would want and would regard as fair. And they would do this in order to attain a reputation for fairness so that in the future, people who have disputes would be willing to agree to go to that arbitrator. Now, the kinds of rules that these arbitrators would make would there's a good chance that they would be basically libertarian laws. So there would be laws that protect you from having your rights violated by other people, but they probably would not have paternalistic or moralistic rules. And with the reason for that being that there aren't that many people who would be willing to pay to stop other people from doing allegedly immoral things that don't actually hurt them. Right, so like you might not like your neighbor using drugs, but if he's not actually directly hurting you, you probably don't want to pay to stop him from doing that. What are the motivations for capitalist anarchism? Two main things. So first, the capitalist anarchists think that the government is constantly violating people's individual rights. This is basically because the government forces everyone to sign up for their services, and that's a violation of their rights. Also, the government does lots of other things. They make laws that are not really necessary and are not protecting people's rights, and many of these laws might violate your individual liberty. The second motivation is capitalism is typically more efficient than government-run provision of services. So if you think about most businesses are controlled by private individuals, not the government. And the reason for that is that it usually works out better that way. Right? And so if you accept that, then you should wonder, well, why shouldn't the services of security provision and dispute resolution also be the same way? Wouldn't they also be more efficient if there was market competition? Okay, so now we'll talk more about how anarcho-capitalism is supposed to work and whether it would actually be good or not in future lectures. But right now I'm just going to try to compare anarcho-capitalism to anarcho-socialism. And in the paper that you're supposed to read, I argue that anarcho-capitalism is better than anarcho-socialism for three main reasons. The first reason has to do with crime. Basically, the anarcho-capitalists have a better answer to crime than socialists. The anarcho-socialists don't have a very good way of dealing with criminals. Right. These are the good points about the capitalist answer to crime. So in any society, there are going to be some people who are trying to exploit other people in a very direct and not controversial way, like robbing people or physically attacking people. Now, that happens in every society in the world and has always happened, so you have to have somebody do something about that. Now, the capitalist response to this is to have private security agencies that people could hire to protect them. So maybe your neighborhood would have a homeowners association, and maybe they would hire a security agency to provide security for that neighborhood. Now, the capitalist response to crime, it has these desirable features. First, it explains what would motivate people to act in the way that the anarcho-capitalist wants them to act. So you would hire these security agencies out of self-interest. The security agencies would try to do a good job of protecting people also out of self-interest because there would be competition. So if your agency doesn't do a good job of protecting people, or if it beats up the customers or shoots the customers, the agency can lose business to competing agencies. Notice, by the way, that this is not true of the government. So if the government police beat up people or shoot innocent people or things like that, or if they just simply don't do a good job of protecting people, they don't lose to a competitor because there is no competitor. So the government police will not get fired and replaced with a competing agency. Similarly, the arbitrators in this system would try to get a reputation for fairness and impartiality. And the reason for this is that they want people who have disputes to be able to agree on going to them to resolve those disputes. And the reason why customers would want to go to arbitrators is that, it's in your interest, if you have a dispute with someone, it's in your interest to resolve it peacefully. And the best way of resolving a dispute peacefully is to go to an impartial third party that you and the other person can agree upon. Right? So all of this it's not appealing to the assumption that people are altruistic or that they're going to sacrifice themselves for the good of society. It's just appealing to self-interest. It's just saying it would be in your interest to do these things. And so that's why we anticipate that people will act in this way. Notice that the anarcho-capitalist answer to crime does not require alterations of human nature. We're not saying that after this anarcho-capitalist society comes about, people will drastically change their motivations. We don't require people to change their character traits. We're just taking ordinary selfish people. It also doesn't require people to drastically change their ideological beliefs. So the system doesn't require that everybody has this kind of libertarian ideology or anarchist ideology or whatever. It just requires that people can recognize their self-interest. Now, these are some points that are common to both the capitalist and the socialist anarchist responses to crime. So anarchists of all stripes agree that the government actually causes a lot of crime. This is particularly with what they call vice crime laws, the laws against prostitution, gambling, drugs, and things like this. These are laws that they basically try to stop behavior that some people consider to be immoral, but that don't exactly have a clear victim. And now in the United States and many other countries, there are quite a lot of people who are imprisoned for drug crimes. So in the US, around 17% of prisoners are incarcerated for a drug crime. That's people for whom a drug crime is their most serious offense, because often people are incarcerated for multiple offenses, right? But this is people for whom the drug crime is the most serious offense that they're in for. So, and in an anarchist society of either variety, it's unlikely that there would be these kinds of laws. It's unlikely that they would prohibit drug use. Because there basically isn't that much motivation to do it. There's not enough there are people who don't like other people using drugs, but there's just not enough motivation. Like, you wouldn't want to pay a bunch of money to have somebody go over and stop your neighbors from using drugs. But if you can just cast a vote and that's the only cost, then people are more willing to do that. So that's why democratic societies are more likely to prohibit drugs rather than anarchist societies. Okay, now there's also other crime besides drug crimes themselves that are contributed to. So the illegality of drugs results in strengthening of organized crime, because that's where organized criminals get most of their revenue. Most of their revenue stream comes from drug sales, and to a lesser extent other vice crimes like prostitution or gambling. And so they would be a lot weaker if there was no drug prohibition. Also, some non-drug crimes are caused because drugs are very expensive, so people will steal money in order to get money for drugs. And they typically don't do that for things that aren't illegal. So you don't really hear about people stealing in order to afford alcohol. And the reason for that is, well, alcohol is not as expensive because it's not illegal. So we could assume that there would be a large drop in crime, so there would be at least a 17% drop in people who are imprisoned, and maybe more than that, maybe double that. If you're really optimistic, maybe half the crime would stop if we legalize drugs. But on the other hand, it wouldn't be a drastic drop. It wouldn't be like a 90% drop. There would still be a lot of crime that would still be going on even without the drug laws. Okay, these are other things that the anarcho-socialists say. So sometimes they predict that there would be less crime because there would be less poverty in the socialist society. Maybe the society would be overall more just, and so therefore maybe people would be more happy with the society, and maybe there would be more love among people in the society. Maybe people would bring up their children better and raise them to be non-criminal and pro-social. Maybe the society would adopt better rehabilitation programs for criminals, because the government presently doesn't have very good rehabilitation, and most people who go to prison, when they get out, they commit crimes again. Maybe there would be more community spirit in the socialist society. Okay, now these are very optimistic assumptions, but unfortunately they're very speculative, and there's very little to no empirical evidence that these things would actually happen. If you try to think about it realistically, there have been attempts. So think in particular, for example, about the proposal of having better rehabilitation programs. Well, it's not really that simple. If you could just say, hey, let's rehabilitate criminals, and like if there was an easy known way of doing that, we would be doing that. People in the status quo are not stupid. I mean, the government has problems, but they're not completely stupid. If there was an easy way of stopping people from going out and committing crimes again, they would do it. It's just really hard, right? And all of these other things. So making people more loving or bringing up your children better so they don't become criminals. Well, we don't actually know that we can do that. We're just like hoping that we could do that in a socialist society. But if there was an obvious known way of doing all of those things, we would have already done it. A larger problem is that the socialists have a particular view about where crime comes from. That's probably not true. So they typically think that the causes of crime have to do with how people are brought up or how people are incorrectly taught when they're children or something like this. But it may be that crime is rooted in human nature in a more fundamental way. It may be that people are biologically programmed for selfishness. And you can understand why this would be true. Because in our evolutionary past, people who served their own interests were more likely to successfully reproduce and so on. So it's very plausible that there's actually a biological basis for this. And what this means is that you can't just stop crime by teaching people to be unselfish. Right? There's not really any good evidence that you can do that. Now, a related problem is there's a small percentage of society who are actually literally psychopaths. So somewhere between 1% and 3% of society are psychopaths. These are people who have literally no capacity at all for empathy. They're literally incapable of empathizing with another person. And they are literally completely incapable of moral reasoning. They do not understand what the word morally wrong or morally right means. Okay, now these people are, although they're estimated to be only 1 to 3% of the population, they're a large percentage of the people who are in prison. Okay, and this condition is largely genetic, and it's virtually impossible to change. If you have a psychopath, they're basically like that for their entire life. They start when they're children. They start doing things like torturing animals when they're children, and they're basically never cured. Right? And so if that is the reason for a large portion of the crime, and so it's not really realistic to say, well, we're going to stop crime by just having society be more just, or we'll just like pay people equally and then there won't be crime. No, right? The psychopaths are going to continue to commit crimes. Okay, now the anarcho-socialists do allow for there to be community security forces, so they're not relying entirely on better upbringing. But creating a community security force just introduces some of the problems that explained why they didn't like government in the first place. So when you have a government, they worry about who's going to protect you from the government. Won't the government exploit people and oppress people? Well, if you establish a community security force, whether or not you call it government, won't it have the same problem? If there's a security force that's powerful enough to enforce the laws and stop any criminals, why wouldn't it also have the power to exploit the rest of the community and oppress them and do exactly the things that the government does that the socialist anarchists object to? Now notice that things are different in the anarcho-capitalist solution. In the anarcho-capitalist solution, there is an answer to this. The reason the security forces won't exploit you and oppress you is that they're in competition with other security forces. So if your security force starts exploiting you, then you switch to a different security force. Right? And the anarcho-socialists don't have that answer because they don't have the idea of competition. They don't want there to be multiple competing security forces, probably because that's kind of too capitalistic. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second major problem for the anarcho-socialist society. This is that anarcho-capitalism would probably be much more economically efficient than anarcho-socialism. And why is this? So basically, capitalists serve three important economic functions, which I discussed in a previous class, but I'll repeat it a little bit here. First of all, capitalists serve the important function of risk acceptance. So in order to have economic growth, a society has to have people who are willing to take risks. Whenever a business is started, there's a significant risk that it will go bankrupt. In fact, even businesses that have been operating for multiple years can go bankrupt. And so there has to be somebody who's willing to accept that risk. In other words, somebody has to be in line to lose their money if and when the business fails. Most ordinary workers do not want to take that risk. So when you go to work for a business, you don't want to take the risk that you won't get paid unless the business makes enough money. And so part of the function of capitalists is that the capitalist puts up the money so that they take the loss if the business doesn't make money and the workers still get paid. If workers don't want to take that risk, then somebody else has to do it. The second economic function of capitalists is delayed gratification. In order to have economic growth, there have to be people who forego current consumption in order to save resources, to use those resources to increase production in the future. And capitalists they tend to be people who have a lower time preference, meaning they're more willing to forego current consumption in order to have more consumption in the future. Average ordinary workers don't really want to do that. So they want to get a reward now. They don't want to just like wait for a few years to get a reward. Okay, the third major function of capitalists is deciding how resources should be allocated. So in any economy that's going to grow or change at all, there has to be somebody who evaluates the quality of business ideas to decide how resources should be allocated. Somebody has to be able to say, is this a good idea or is this not a good idea? And capitalists are basically people who they do that. They look at a business idea and decide whether they think that it's going to work out. And this requires a certain amount of skill. Now, people who are capitalists for a long time tend to be skilled at this, much more skilled than the average person. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a selection effect. If you're not good at it, you're going to lose your money. And so you won't be able to keep doing it. So the people who keep doing this, who keep operating as capitalists for a long time, are the people who are good at that. They're good at deciding what businesses will work out. Now, these are all highly valuable functions. You can't have a growing economy without having them. And they're things that most people don't want to do, and you certainly wouldn't want to do if you don't get paid for it. So these are things that merit payment. Most people are either unwilling to do them or they're unable to do them very well. Okay, now you might think, so that's all very good, so maybe the capitalist society is economically efficient, but you might wonder if the capitalist society is fair. So many people would still say that the capitalist society is unfair because it doesn't pay workers enough. It doesn't pay them as much as they deserve, and maybe it overpays the capitalists. It pays them more than they deserve. Right, so here's a response to this. Now, to start with, here's a plausible general moral principle about fairness. It seems that the fair pay rate for somebody's contribution to a business is not greater than their marginal product. This is the most that you could reasonably ask for. And what I mean by your marginal product is it's the difference in profit that you make to the business. In other words, with you present, the business makes a certain amount of profit, and if they remove you, keeping everything else roughly the same or as much the same as possible, the business will presumably make less profit. So that difference is your marginal product, right? How much you're increasing the productivity of the business as a whole. Okay, now it's not reasonable for you to expect to be paid more than that, because if you are paid more than that, that means that the rest of the people in the business would be better off without you. You shouldn't expect to be paid so much that the rest of the business is better off without having you. Okay, now in standard economic theory, wages in a competitive market are approximately equal to the worker's marginal product. because a business should pay the worker about their marginal product. The reason for this is if you're paying workers less than their marginal product, that means that you can increase your total profit by hiring more workers. If you're paying workers more than their marginal product, that means that you could increase your profits by laying off workers. So the only time when you're maximizing your profit is when you're paying equal to the marginal product of the workers. If you're paying less than the marginal product, then you hire more workers and you keep doing that until the productivity falls to the level where it's equal to the wage that you have to pay. So therefore, under capitalism, workers are typically paid about the most that could reasonably be asked. They can't reasonably ask to be paid more than the amount that they're contributing. Now you might wonder, well, why are capitalists paid as much as they're paid? Basically, the reason is that their marginal product is typically much greater than that of a worker. In other words, they make a bigger difference to how productive and profitable a given company is. The reason for that is basically that they affect the direction of other people's labor and a large number of other people. So a single person, a single worker doing a good job can slightly increase the productivity of the company, but a capitalist who does a good job at his tasks can make a much bigger difference to the productivity of the businesses that he gets involved in. Okay, I'm turning to the third major problem with socialism. This is that socialism would probably not survive. It would probably just evolve into capitalism. And so therefore, the socialists don't really have a position that makes much sense. Why is this? The first problem is the worker cooperatives would probably be outcompeted by capitalist structured businesses. Right, so in the anarcho-socialist society, because there's no central authority, there's not supposed to be a government controlling the entire society, so there's no one to stop somebody from starting up a capitalist business. And so as soon as somebody starts up a capitalist business, then the worker cooperatives have to compete with the capitalist business. And for the reasons discussed previously, because of the valuable economic functions provided by capitalists, the capitalist structured business will probably be more economically efficient. So it will probably just outcompete a worker cooperative in the marketplace. By the way, in our current society, it's perfectly legal to have a worker cooperative. It's also perfectly legal to have a capitalist business. It just happens that most businesses are structured in the capitalistic way. In other words, they have a small number of people who are owners and then a bunch of people who are workers and not owners. And that structure of business in our actual society today is outcompeting the worker cooperatives in most cases. There aren't very many worker cooperatives, and that shows you that the worker co-ops aren't doing that well at competing. Right, there are still some, so they wouldn't be completely eliminated. It's just that they wouldn't attain this status of being almost every business in the society as the socialists are hoping. Okay, another problem is that the capitalist businesses could hire away the most productive workers from the socialist businesses by offering them more money. And the reason for this is that the socialist businesses would be paying about equal amounts to all of their workers. And I say this because that's what the socialists say. A central part of their motivation is they want there to be equality. So they're hoping that these socialist businesses are going to pay about equal amounts, or maybe actually equal amounts, to everyone who works for them. So that means the most productive workers will get paid the same amount as the least productive workers. So that means a capitalist business could offer more money to the more productive workers and hire them away from the socialist business. Also, now you might think that some people would just prefer working for a socialist business, maybe because they believe in the ideals of socialism. But this has been tested in our actual society, because in our actual society, you can, if you want, go and join a commune. There are some communes, they're not illegal, but most people just don't go and join. Or you can join a worker cooperative, but most people don't do that. And the reason is, well, most people, as it turns out, in our actual society, prefer working for a capitalist business for more money rather than working for a socialist structured business. Okay, this is another problem about the stability of the socialist society. The worker cooperatives might dissolve internally. So that is, the workers working for a cooperative might convert it into a capitalist structured business. And why would they do this? Well, they could make money by selling their ownership stake. So suppose that you work for a particular business and you own a portion of that business. You could make money by just selling your portion to somebody else who doesn't work for the business. So it would be in your interest to do that. Now you might imagine that the business would have rules that prevent you from doing that, but there's no central authority, and the workers are just the final authority, so they could just vote to allow themselves to sell shares of the business, and it would be in their economic self-interest to do that, because as soon as they vote for that rule change, all of them, their shares would go up in value. So they would acquire market value because there's more possibility of selling them. There's more stuff that you can do if you allow yourself to sell your shares. Okay, here's the last problem about stability. The social welfare programs that the socialist societies are supposed to adopt would invite collapse. So the socialist businesses are supposed to provide welfare programs, free schooling, free health care. They're supposed to provide welfare for people who are not working, who are unable to work, and so on. And the capitalist businesses don't have to do that. So what this means is that the socialist structured businesses, they're going to have less money available. So they're going to have to pay lower wages to their workers because some of their money is going to provide these social welfare programs. And because they have lower wages, that means that it would be in the interest of workers to leave and join a capitalist business. And in particular, the most productive workers, it would be in their interest to leave. Now, the people who are poor and who need help, they would stay. So productive people who would make more money in a capitalist business would leave, and then the people who have greater needs and the people who are unable to work or who don't have any skills, they would stay because they want to receive social welfare. And that's just a dynamic that's going to lead the social community to collapse. They're going to have fewer people producing and more people with greater needs. The capitalist businesses are then going to be prospering. Now, you might have an objection. You might think, well, maybe people who belong to these socialistic communities will just have charitable impulses, and they'll just stay because they want to help other members of their community. But in response, even if you're altruistic and you like to help other people just for its own sake, you should still leave the socialist community and join a capitalist business. Because after you go to the capitalist business, you're going to be making more money, and then you can still freely give away this money that you're making, and you can give away more money. If you want to help other people, you could help more other people by going to the capitalist business and making more money and then giving that to effective charities. Also, by the way, if you work for the capitalist business and you make more money, you can give it to whatever cause you want. When you go to the socialist business, you wind up in effect giving money to whatever the majority of the community votes for, which is unlikely to exactly match your preferences. So even if you're a completely altruistic, charitable person, you still should leave the socialist society and join the capitalist society. Right, so in conclusion, socialist anarchy would probably not work very well, but fortunately it wouldn't last very long.